Catalyst 2030 started life as a WhatsApp group among social entrepreneurs, connecting to envision real transformational change. Launched at the World Economic Forum in January 2020, it's grown into a global movement accelerating change to ensure the SDGs are reached by 2030. Fueled by passion, our 550 members working in 175 countries have collectively put in an amazing 50,000 volunteer hours, touching the lives of 2 billion people. And we're driven by values, to which we hold ourselves accountable. 2020 was a busy year, co-creating 3 reports with partners and producing one of our own. Inviting high-level guests to participate in the Catalyzing Change campaign, hosting fireside chats and expert hours, which will be continuing in 2021. To celebrate our achievements, together we placed our supporters in the limelight with the first Catalyst 2030 Awards for Systemic Change. With the blessing of the Dalai Lama, we celebrated finalists and winners in the following categories: special recognition for our early supporters, individual philanthropists, donor organizations, philanthropic intermediaries, corporate organizations, bi- and multilateral organizations, and 4 regional winners in the category of national governments. And now on to Catalyzing Change Week 2021. During this social entrepreneur-led event, we bring together diverse stakeholders in over 100 sessions to showcase their systems change efforts and the best practices that can accelerate our work in pursuit of the SDGs.
In the cavalcade of sessions hosted by Catalyst 2030, we are very honored to get a chance to be with you. I'm here, my name is Mary Galletti, and I run the Tecovas Foundation. And I am here with 2 of our grantee colleagues, both from Global Press Institute and from the Accountability Lab. And I'm going to give them a chance to briefly introduce themselves. But first, I want to take a moment and just explain why we're here. I think anytime funders or nonprofits are doing significant work in difficult contexts or dangerous contexts, we need to be very thoughtful about those doing the work and how we think about their care, their safety, and security. And oftentimes, especially with nonprofits, NGOs, and funders, we sort of forget the key pieces of journalists can't always be extracted when it's their home, or government accountability activists can't always be extracted when it's their neighborhood. And so how do we think about doing that work better? And so a few years ago, the Tecovas Foundation started an experiment, both with Accountability Lab and with Global Press, to try and figure out if we could crack some of that nut. And I'll let them tell a little bit more of the story. So I'll start with you, Christy, if you want to introduce yourself briefly, and then Jean.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Hegrenis. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Press. We are an international news organization that is building independent news bureaus in more than 40 communities around the world, from Mexico to Mongolia to Democratic Republic of Congo. We employ an all-female reporting team to tell stories of consequence to both a local and a global audience.
Hi everyone, my name is Jean and I'm Director for Growth and Strategy at the Accountability Lab. We're a translocal network working in 9 different countries around the world: Mali, Pakistan, Liberia, Nigeria, Niger, South Africa, Mexico, Zimbabwe, DRC, Somaliland, to make governance work for people. And we mostly are looking at supporting active citizens and responsible leaders and to build accountable institutions.
Thanks. Now, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to tell a brief story, and then I'm going to let sort of Christy do some framing, and then Jean follow on. So I don't know how long ago it was, but many years ago, Christy and I had met up for breakfast in Washington, D.C. at a little sort of hotel restaurant. And she sat down and she said, "If you don't mind, I'm going to leave my phone out on the table." And I said, "Sure, that's fine. I'm not worried about it, but is everything okay?" And she said, "Oh, I might have to go to Qatar tonight. I'm not sure." And I was like, I feel like somebody should generally know when they're going to go to Qatar that night. And it's not really, why are you unsure whether you're going to Qatar tonight? And she explained that some of her journalists from, is it Nepal? Were they Nepalese? Some of her journalists from Nepal had basically snuck into Qatar and were covering the awful working conditions, mostly for the Nepalese in Qatar. And she was worried that they were going to get caught and arrested. And so she was prepared at any moment to get on an airplane and go to Qatar and deal with that situation. And I was like, that's amazing and sounds very stressful. And also, as the funder here, where is that in your budget? And she's like, oh, it comes out of my paycheck. Like I just deal with it if I need to. And I thought that was not necessarily sustainable, nor reasonable, nor appropriate. And so we hatched a plot, which was to try this kind of grant that would be the most restricted grant we could come up with. The idea was that we would give her a grant for about $20,000 that would sit functionally in a savings account as an experiment. And if some emergency arose, then that money could go to dealing with that emergency. And so Christy took that and kind of ran with it. And it became something we could never even imagine. So we repeated a bit of that experiment with the Accountability Lab, and they took it in a fairly different direction. And then in fairness, we've repeated that experiment with a couple of different organizations as well, including the Aspen Youth Leadership Fellowship, who also just signed on. Hi, John. And so we've been trying to learn from that. And now I'm trying to sort of take this out on the road and figure out how we can get A, more organizations to adopt it as part of their budget structure, and B, how to get more funders comfortable with seeing that in grant budgets and paying for it and understanding the ways in which it's valuable. So I'll hand it to Christy now to take a couple of minutes and just explain the evolution from her standpoint, and then Jean. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're collecting them for later.
Thanks, Mary. I think it's such a pivotal story because it reflects something that I think is so true for most organizations, that the ethos of duty of care is there, but the operational logistics and reality of what it takes to provide comprehensive, holistic safety and security isn't necessarily there. Right. So almost 10 years ago, when I was like, look, I want to do what I need to do for my journalists, who are these badass women doing what they need to do to bring about accurate information in a better world, I was willing to do it and I was ready to do it, but it wasn't a strategy, right? It was reactionary. And so what this work with the Coast Foundation has allowed us to do is we spent 3 years doing risk assessments, roadmaps, implementation plans. And the Global Press Duty of Care program has truly become the industry standard for international organizations with international staff. Because there's a real reality here, right? Security parity in the international nonprofit space doesn't exist. As an American citizen, if I go to the Congo, or if I go to Zimbabwe, or if I go to Qatar, there's an entirely different set of safety options available to me that just aren't available to Global Press reporters who are entirely local women from the communities that they cover. So we took this really transformational conversation with Mary that day, and we built something extraordinary. So as I said, it took us 3 years of research and implementation to come up with what we have today, which is an interconnected set of security solutions that prioritizes 4 types of security at the same time: physical, emotional, digital, and legal. Okay, so those 4 pieces of security are all equal in the duty of care program, all of equal importance. But then we had to address another problem, which is security conversations are reactionary. Shit happens and we deal with the shit, right? And so this duty of care program is like, okay, how do we get ahead of it? How do we do real risk assessments? How do we update those risk assessments constantly? And how do we create policies and practices within the organization that mitigate risk every second of every day? And that's what duty of care is. So about 20% of duty of care takes place in training. We didn't want to make the mistake that so many organizations make, which is like, I'm going to send you to a security training once every 5 years, and then we'll just like cross your fingers that you never have to use it. Training is important, but it makes up about 20% of the overall program. About 70% of the program is day-to-day policy and programmatic implementation. Every single staff member at Global Press had a rewritten job description that now includes some aspect of duty of care monitoring and evaluation. So it's travel protocols, it's how reporters deal with sensitive information, it's digital security in high-tech and low-tech environments. it's the way that we work every day that now has an underscore of duty of care. And that's work, right? That's hard to do. It's expensive. It takes time, like all the things. But we decided after this pivotal conversation with Mary that if we were not willing to invest in duty of care at the highest level, we had no business doing this work. And so we made duty of care our business. So the last piece of duty of care, that last like final 10%, is crisis response and risk management. So when things do go bad, because if the last 18 months have taught us anything, it's that the world is an unpredictable and wild place. We have to be ready for it. So crisis contingency plans that include legal strategies, digital surveillance strategies, all these kinds of things that come in the crisis response package. So that's how it works. And we have seen extraordinary results. One last thing I want to just briefly call out is a new network that we created just 2 years ago called the Global Press Wellness Network. I mentioned that emotional security is a key component of duty of care. The reality is that journalists experience stress, trauma, and anxiety at levels that rival active duty service members. Yet within the news space, conversations about trauma are taboo in newsrooms. And the reality is that mental health services in most global press coverage communities are poor to non-existent. So we developed our own. The Global Press Wellness Network is a global network of more than 30 counselors who are all licensed and all speak the language of our reporters. Our reporters have free unlimited sessions that we pay for use of the Wellness Network. Reporters can do one-time critical incident processing sessions. They can do long-term trauma work with these counselors. So that has become a critical component of our work. It is also something that the data is telling us not only makes our journalists more likely to stay with global press, it makes them more likely to take risks in stories. It makes them more likely to just really push the envelope because they know that there is holistic care available to them in the organization. And we never violate the core principle of duty of care, which is the person is more important than the story.
Thanks. I just want to add one other thing, which is I think is the most important parts, right? The title of the session is about radical trust. And that's not just about us as a funder being like, we trust you to make the appropriate calls for your team. It's also that this is true, I know, at Global Press, and I think it's true at Accountability Lab as well. Like duty of care grants, not grants, like safety and security fund release does not happen with you, Christy. It's not somebody calling you at 2 o'clock in the morning. That is pushed out down into bureaus, with the exception, I think, of if there's potential legal risk to the whole of the organization. If you just want to give a minute about that, and then I'll hand it to Jean to lay out their plan as well.
Yeah, that's such an important piece, right? So often, well, I think two things that are really common with funders. One is funders don't ask about risk at all, or they ask about it in sort of like a checkbox kind of way, which is like risks, right? Okay, we talked about it, like now let's move on. And there's kind of a reverse incentive there, right, for organizations to not transparently discuss risk because we're getting the message from funders that like it's not a priority, right? So two things. One is we have to operationalize duty of care in a way that makes the local individual able to solve their own problems when they can and not have to go through like a long bureaucratic chain to get funds released, et cetera, right? We have had funders say to us in the past, oh, well, if you ever have an emergency, just let me know and we can process a quick grant in 90 days. Well, what if I need something in 19 minutes? Then what, right? Or 90 seconds, then what? So I think that that's a really critical piece. And then the other piece that's so important in this conversation around just radical trust, and Jean and I were just talking about this last week, is we made the decision at Global Press to not fundraise for duty of care as a separate entity. We now have a 3% budget line in every single grant, every single gift that we get that goes to duty of care. And so we are sending the message to funders, this is a priority. It is a priority that tops all things because it is in every grant. And I have had funders say to us before, oh, we don't fund benefits, or we don't want to fund duty of care. And that is money that we're very happy to say no to, because we need funding partners who have that same ethos around duty of care that we do, and also that understand that resources and assets have to be in the hands of reporters, not controlled from the United States, if security is going to be operationalized in a meaningful and time appropriate way.
Thanks so much. Jean, do you want to talk about Accountability Lab's experience?
Sure. Thanks. And I do want to start this off with, I think Christy is the trailblazer here. We're just sort of learning along. So let's start with that, because we're a few years behind her. But I think, like so many nonprofits that work in the accountability or social accountability space, we all have the policies and procedures to address child safeguarding and risk mitigation and crises. And I think that is the legal and contractual side of safeguarding and duty of care, and it's really important, and we should all do that. But for us, there's also the moral one, and we found that so many of these policies just inadequately supported us when we were faced with real life challenges like Ebola, like coups. But we're also not those frontline people who are in the thick of it. We're not humanitarian responders. We're not the journalists who can potentially get beaten. And so we're in a little bit of a different space where, while our teams are as threatened, I think, as many others, we're just not also seen as doing the dangerous job. And so I think for us with duty of care, and that's also why I was so excited to meet Christy, was because she used the words that we were struggling to use with donors, and to saying, hey guys, this is important, please don't forget us, and forget that this stuff is important. And they're like, yes, but you've got the policy. And I was like, yeah, but that doesn't really help. And I think, when Blair had a conversation with both, I think, Christy and Mary, and was saying, hey, this is a similar issue for us. I think our biggest challenge is getting through auditors who are like, but we don't understand this account. We don't know. Like, what do you mean you don't? Where's the contract? And I'm like, there isn't one, and it's essentially inevitable, forever. And I think it's a mindset shift that we're all needing to do. And so for us, what duty of care looks like is training, ongoing support, and a lot of sort of the equity and wellness stuff. So yes, we do trainings with our teams around sort of the emotional, social security, but it's not as large a thing component as it potentially could be. But also we haven't found it to be as necessary. Though what we have found is that the wellness part has almost overwhelmingly been a big need for us. Because I think that there is this within the CSO space, is like this culture of sacrifice and guilt, and, oh, you must just survive through. And we found that our teams are way more happy and engaged, and particularly since COVID, with a few of the bits and pieces that we've put in. So we don't have the network that Christy does, but we've joined or sort of partnered with an organization called LifeWorks. They also have sort of essentially counselors around the world, which are language specific. Each staff member and their families can get up to 5 hours of counseling per year per topic. The other thing that is included is legal support, if they need a lawyer, if they need someone just to help out. And then the other thing that we found actually has also been very much used is stuff like, looking after an elderly grandparent or a disabled child, where people just have some questions and they just want to know, just get a quick answer, and have someone that's outside of the workspace that can answer them. And so that's been really helpful. So LifeWorks has been around for a little while, And then we learned that actually as part of LifeWorks, and in order to get all our teams to sign up to LifeWorks, we created this Wellness Weekly. And the Wellness Weekly has been really important because it's brought our teams into the process of wellness. So now everyone has sort of a hear, listen, do thing, and we send it out and we spotlight different team members. And that has just also brought the team together into a almost neutral but fun conversation about wellness and safeguarding and duty of care. Quickly back to our fund, we've used it 3 times, and every time we've used it, we've been able to replenish it quite quickly, also for 3 major things. We've used it for smaller things. Unfortunately, you know, we're not quite there yet where everyone has individual access to it in the sense of like it can cascade that quickly. We're working on that. But again, within 90 minutes, we can make very quick decisions about, you know, where money needs to go. And yeah, I mean, we're very grateful for the trust, I think, that a donor has put in us to say, hey, this is a thing. And it's definitely something we're expanding out to others and talking about to other donors who I think are very intrigued, but not there yet.
Thanks, Jean. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit now about how you actually came to build your program, for both of you, how you came to sort of, Christy, you touched on this a little bit, but what the actual mechanics of building it were. In particular, one of my favorites was you hired local illustrators and asked questions, like for the first aid kit, right? You hired local illustrators and asked questions about like, okay, you twist your ankle, what's the thing you use? Because an ACE bandage wouldn't be the thing, probably. And Jean, similarly, how you guys have thought about sort of building your response, like, and how you've road tested it as it's gone along. What's been working, what's been powerful, what's been less powerful.
Yeah, local efficacy is like the most important thing, right? So this assumption that as a global organization, we have to design like a one-stop solution that works for everyone is just like kind of meaningless. And by kind of meaningless, I mean totally meaningless. So as part of that, as Mary mentioned, as part of the physical security aspect of Global Press, there is an emergency first aid piece. And, you know, as I mentioned, we did this 3 years of research. And one of the things we looked for is, you know, who's doing like this type of training in different global markets. And what we found is that the majority of these trainings are really done for expats or foreigners who are preparing to go overseas. They're not really like locally, you know, locally led or locally articulated. So we designed a emergency first aid training program that allowed reporters to care for 5 major types of injuries that we're most commonly seeing, right? So we did a lot of surveys, a lot of research about what truly are the risks, right? I think that's another thing, particularly in the journalism space, is what do we hear about when we hear about journalist risks, right? We hear about people who are kidnapped, people who are like raped, sexually assaulted, or disappeared. The reality is that is less than 1% of the types of risks that journalists face on a regular basis. So we had to do a lot of our own research to say like, okay, what truly is the risk assessment? What truly are we trying to mitigate? And we learned a couple of things, right? Where the hostile environments training say like, here's how you treat a gunshot wound and here's how you treat this or that. Most common risks that over the last 15 years our journalists have faced is injuries on this part of their hands when they fall off the back of a motorcycle taxi. So knowing how to treat yourself or someone else who has a serious like hand injury, so critical, right? But then it's like, okay, what do you treat it with? You have to have a small first aid kit that is stocked with locally available and accessible products. So that's just a little like touch of the research that went into it. Overall, it's essentially a 3-part plan, right? There's roadmap and risk assessment, truly understanding what is the risk that you're facing and how do you build a roadmap to like mitigating those specific risks. Then there's implementation plans. This is policies, it's procedures, it's things that resources, assets that you need to operationalize duty of care on a regular basis. And then the third and the most important piece really is regular audit of the roadmap and the implementation, because the world changes all the time. And not the whole world, but sometimes specific markets, right? When we open in a market, it might be a government transitioning democratically, and 5 years later, it's a full-on authoritarian state. It's a very different level of risk assessment. So we really prioritize those three parts of the plan in concert with each other, because it really is essential to operating holistic, inclusive safety and security.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, I go back to sort of the little example I made about how the Wellness Weekly has been a really big part of building our duty of care, and how, and sort of gathering what people are interested in, what they need. Again, I think very similar to Christy, the world changes and very rapidly, and what people need, it constantly changes. And so as we started building in the beginning, you know, I think we really looked at what did people need, and for how much would that cost, and how would we, and is that something that we need to do, or is that something that other people can do within our organization? And I think that was sort of the starting point. And then and sort of what constitutes an emergency. And so we developed a small document which is on our website, about how sort of our little safety and security fund works. And then from there, we've sort of then been building out as essentially we have experiences. So we are asking more deliberate questions now. But in the beginning, it was really about, we experienced something and we're like, okay, great. We need to quickly adapt and see how does what we have, is it fit for purpose? And so if, for example, the first thing was sort of end of days crisis, which is what we originally were like, okay, the money is for end of days, like there's a coup or something. Then we realized, actually, again, like Christy, it doesn't really happen that often. Like, thank goodness. So now moving on from end of days, maybe it does mean that someone's burnt out and we need to use the money so that someone can get a little bit of additional psychosocial care in a country where that doesn't exist, or there's one psychiatrist, for example. And that's fine, that's okay. That is, in our world, that is an end of days issue. And so we've included now those sorts of things. So we're not quite as far as Christy, but I think for us, it's really about being iterative and learning and understanding that you're not going to think about all the crises right away, but that your policy is flexible enough that you can add new things. Because I think so often these things are created and put in a box or in a cupboard or somewhere, and then someone's like, great, yeah, we have a policy, but the policy is not fit for purpose.
Thanks. If folks have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to ask one or two more questions of Christy and Jean, and then open it up a little bit. So I want to ask a question about the chaos that has been the last 14 or so months in all of the ways, in many places where you guys are working. How have you, I don't want to say how have you changed how you've thought about duty of care? I imagine that underlying principle set hasn't evolved much, but what has that meant for you and your teams? How has that conversation gone with donors? I know donors have been a very weird thing in the last year. Some have pulled back, some have sort of reallocated, some have woken up and decided they're all public health funders now, whatever it happens to be. But I wonder if you wanted to reflect just a little bit on that and maybe some lessons learned going forward.
So in a very interesting way, I think that COVID was a remarkable opportunity for the philanthropic community to reassess what risk is and who experiences risk, right? It was because COVID forced us to say like, oh, risk isn't a thing that happens to people over there. Risk happens to all of us. And we all found ourselves in situations where we needed more of something that we didn't know that we needed until the world was such where we were like, oh shit, we need that. And so we saw some great trends in the philanthropic community last year. Groups making more unrestricted gifts, which is a critical part of duty of care, right? I think that, all restricted gifts have, pros and cons, but unrestricted gifts really allow organizations to be nimble and to address safety and security needs as they arise. So we saw a lot of previously restricted funds become unrestricted. And we also just saw a lot more donors asking questions about like, what do you need? in a way that was new and exciting. And I think it's our job on the grantee side to insist that those conversations continue as, you know, we come into whatever like post-pandemic life looks like. In terms of reporters on the ground, last year was tough, right? Being a journalist is not like a work from home profession. And throughout the course of the year, there were points where 100% of our journalists were on lockdown. Also in some communities where reporters were considered essential personnel, them being considered essential personnel on paper and what that looked like in reality was really different, right? We saw transitioning and authoritarian regimes use the pandemic to really close doors for access to information and to do a lot of like increasingly shady stuff that they didn't want journalists around for. So like in Zimbabwe, for example, our journalists really struggled to figure out, you know, like, yes, we can technically be out, but every time we're out, somebody gets arrested. So, you know, really challenging circumstances. On a positive side, we saw the number of street harassments for reporters go down, but online harassment of journalists across the world is on the rise, which is why digital security is such an important component of duty of care. And I think one of the things that we are most proud of is that throughout 2020, 0 global press reporters tested positive for COVID, in part because we transitioned everyone's contracts to training in lieu of production when they were not able to be out producing. So led by Lakshmi, our COO, really nimbly transitioned everyone's contracts to essentially help them in a program called Learning on Lockdown, where we said, okay, you can't be out reporting, but let's bolster your skills. Let's do a set of advanced skills training so that when the doors do open, you are ready to tell some kick-ass stories that the world really needs.
Thanks.
I cannot stress enough, I think, the post-pandemic conversation that needs to happen with many donors, because I think for so many countries, they're still well into Corona and it's not going away, at least for another year, maybe 2, maybe 3. You know, I'm South African, and we know that likelihood of everyone getting vaccinated before June of 2022 is not really a thing. So South Africa is going to continue to go through these. And as we know, even in the US, 80%, vaccination. And I think that's South Africa. That's not even some of the more vulnerable countries that we work in. And so I think having these sort of conversations with donors who in the beginning were incredibly flexible, and we had all the donors coming in asking us questions. And I think it's really important that we, as Christy said, continue to have these conversations and force these conversations and also be practical about them. So some of the most practical things about saying, okay, so what we really need is, because a lot of our teams use the internet at the office. And so we spend a lot of money on making sure that the internet and the facilities at the office are really great. But now everyone's in lockdown at home. So how do they charge their laptops? And so maybe it is about saying, hey, I know that money was supposed to go to programming, but we really need that $150 to buy a little solar panel thing. Now, many donors are like, yes, of course, that's great, so good. But now they're like, well, but there's not really a problem anymore. So I don't understand. The USAID yesterday brought their big thing to say, oh, we're not so keen on funding PPE so much anymore. I mean, we will, but only in special occasions. And I'm like, but that's not the case for the rest of the world. And I think that's what changed last year. Is it opened the door. Now it's our job to keep that door open.
Thanks. So there are a couple of interesting questions that have come through. One about smaller CSOs start on the duty of care journey, from Sheena Adams. Any advice for beginning to implement some of these provisions on a small scale, starting with relevant conversations with donors?
It's such an important question. And, just for context, Global Press is a $4 million a year organization, right? So we are super small, super nimble. And when I was in the research phase of duty of care back in 2017, I had a conversation with a couple of large scale news organizations, Reuters being one, sorry, Reuters. And one of the things that my son is very passionate about duty of care, as you can hear in the background, sorry. one of the things that someone at Reuters told me was that they would love to do more for the safety and security of local journalists, but they just didn't have the funds. I don't know if anybody knows, but Reuters is a multi-million dollar a year organization. And so I think the reality is that it doesn't have to be expensive to get duty of care off the ground. So Sheena, what I would say is going through the roadmap piece to really say like, okay, what are the risks? What do we need to mitigate? That can be done with staff time, right? And there are lots of workshops available out there to also help with that. It can be low cost, but it can be a first step, right? For the organization to really understand, hey, here are the risks that people might not know about that we're regularly working to mitigate. And then you have some research and you have some really core asks to go back to donors and say, you know, this is a part of our work that we've never talked to you about before, but did you know that X% of our, you know, staff or beneficiaries or whoever are experiencing X, Y, and Z type of risks? Here's what we need to mitigate those risks, right? And so I think when organizations are armed with that kind of information, it makes that duty of care conversation really much easier to get off the ground, because I think duty of care is, I think what all of us have to protect against is that duty of care doesn't become a buzzword, right? It doesn't become a synonym for like a cover your ass like checklist of like, here's all the things I did to like, you know, make sure that I don't get sued or that my people are like mostly fine, even if not all the way, right? We have to preserve this phrase duty of care, and we have to freaking mean it. And one of the ways that we mean it is by being really thorough in the research and the risk mitigation and management that we're doing as we begin to present those cases. So Sheena, definitely reach out if you have some questions. We'd love to chat with you about it.
I will just add from the funder standpoint, I crack a joke often. A couple of my grantees know that like I sort of feel like I don't do anything. I email a guy called Eli who's wonderful, and Eli prints the check. Like literally, I say that all the time. Eli's great, by the way. And there's a piece of this work that is just frankly so inexpensive, so easy, and so morally and ethically correct that I don't understand why it's a hard sell. Like the adage of an ounce of prevention is easier than a pound of cure, like stands here in the most firm way. And then on top of that, the fact that it is like it's just entirely the correct thing. I struggle with why funders struggle with it. Now, the argument that they would normally offer that I hear is that like it's really difficult to measure. It's hard to sort of understand what you're paying for. It feels ripe for abuse, and that sort of shocks me. It's like, okay, so you're willing to pay for all of these other things, but you're not willing to pay for this one last bit, which is relatively inexpensive, all things concerned, protects your investment, protects the humans doing the work that you care so much about. And that seems to you just like a bridge too far. Like I really, really struggle in my mind to get my head wrapped around that. And I will name though that for some organizations, and this is going to get John to your question, for some of the organizations that struggle with how to talk to funders or their board about it, there is this question that is real about how long, like, how do you measure this money? How long do we have a reporting requirement? How long do we think about like what does Global Press or Accountability Lab or anybody need to tell to Covis about what they've done with those assets, and for how long is that true? And I think when we did it with Christy, we said, let's try it for 3 years in that no judgment kind of way of just like, we don't know how this is going to work, so let's just see what happens. So tell us when you use it. You don't have to ask our permission, use it, but then just like let us know so we can see what you end up using it for. And after 3 years, that it just felt silly to keep doing that. I mean, I was curious and I always wanted to hear how things were going, but it just felt cumbersome and like it wasn't my business anymore in a funny way. And one of the things that I will name that we hadn't thought through with that, and then we'll get to John's question, is the issue, the sort of contrast in the accountability of those dollars and the absolute value and requirement of the privacy of folks who were in situations that needed that money, right? Like it is not my business to know who needs a doctor or a lawyer or what other emergency has happened to a very specific person. But funders can often ask this question about like, but I need accountability for those dollars. And you run into sort of a real thing of figuring out where the appropriate boundary is to maintain sort of this sanctity of privacy while also like understanding what happens to that cash. And I think Christy, both Christy and Jean, you've done a nice job of towing that line, but I can imagine some funders wanting more detail in a way that feels inappropriate.
So glad you brought that up. I'm so glad you said that, because there is this like culture sometimes of like, you have to prove that you need it. You have to prove that your emergency is like big enough or important enough. And I think that's, again, going back to like the ethos of duty of care, is that an emergency is how it's defined by the local person in that moment, right? We don't want to be like the emergency police, especially because most duty of care funds and resources are used in non-emergent situations, right? When we are talking about holistic wellness, digital security, emotional security, most of the time that is not happening in like emergency contexts. So the privacy piece is really important, making sure that we are not asking international staff to overshare in order to get access to duty of care, to make sure that it's just part of it. It's just part of how it works, that you have this access is so essential in making it work and making your organization trust you, that when you say duty of care, you mean it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I must agree with all of that. And I think, John, one of the big things that we did with our board, who I think in general were very positive and like really very supportive, but you can also have that really hard what if conversation with board members and say, okay, cool, right, so this happens regularly. What if this happens or that happens? And suddenly, and then you're like, but this duty of care program is going to help out with that, or it's going to give people support on this way. And then suddenly it becomes a much easier conversation, because it is in the best interests of the organization to do this. And while we're not necessarily doing it for those sort of very, I think, black and white risk reasons, it's an easy thing to explain, honestly. I mean, we know that teams are happier. We know that people are more likely to, I think, Christy, people are more likely to stay. And that's just good for the organization. So, and then quite quickly, you no longer need to make that monetary argument, because it doesn't really matter anymore. People just know that it's something that's there and it has really good outcomes. So yeah, I think the what if conversation was something we did. And we, I mean, and this isn't so much, we had sort of a safeguarding, like a very formalized safeguarding training with our board. And, then you even mentioned some of the Oxfam things and some of the other risks and challenges, and suddenly board members like perk up and they're like, oh goodness, we don't want to be like that. And I'm like, but, and I was like, yes, but again, that's the extreme, but it is that pound of sort of, we're not even going to let it get that far, ever. We won't ever, because there are these now mechanisms to support those not to happen.
I actually want to, go ahead, please, Christy.
Sorry, I was just going to add one other thing to John's point. John, I'll tell you the thing that makes people the most uncomfortable about duty of care, and that is contextualizing circumstances or situations from a local point of view. So for example, there's a lot of corporate foundations out there that will upgrade a ticket to first class if you're traveling more than X amount of miles, right? And nobody thinks twice or blinks an eye about those like $9,000 plane tickets. Well, we had a situation several times in Democratic Republic of Congo where our reporters had to take a convoy, a UN-led convoy, to get from one part of a province to another when it was a high-risk situation. And you have to pay a bribe to sit in the front of the caravan, which is safer than sitting in the back of the caravan. How uncomfortable is it to talk to funders about a situation where you're like, yeah, it's gonna cost $200 for her to sit in the front car. And guess what we're gonna pay? $200 for her to sit in that front car. In the same way that you upgraded your, United Airlines ticket, I'm going to upgrade the DRC convoy ticket. And that's the kind of stuff that makes people so uncomfortable. And to Jean's point about auditing, it's challenging. And obviously, like, you can have whatever opinion you like to have about systems of like corruption and bribery. that happen all around the world, including the United States. And it's not great, but also, it's part of how the world works. And so having really realistic assessments about how things work and how things need to work in order for people to be safe is super important. And so, our strategy is always just like, let's hit those conversations straight on, let's have them, let's let people be uncomfortable, let's make the uncomfortable parallels, and, together we'll get to a more comfortable place.
I want to push on a part of that because both of you are relatively small organizations. And I know John works for a large organization. Some other folks might be affiliated with larger organizations or thinking about how they would talk to larger, more institutional funders where like the bureaucracy is real, the structures, the hierarchy, the dynamics, all of the things. And so I wonder how, I know, Christy, you've had some of this conversation with some of the big funders who I won't name, but you're welcome to. Jean, and I know you guys have worked with some government agencies and large funders who I won't name, but you're welcome to, about some of these conversations. And you've touched on it a little bit, like contextualizing and explaining, and in some cases projecting the worst case scenario, or like the best case scenario, all of that kind of stuff. But I wonder if you have strategies for navigating some of those bigger bureaucratic sort of scenarios or situations that might be helpful to others.
I think this is the eternal question. I think, again, some are more open than others to even have the conversation in the first place. I think Christy's, point of sometimes you just kind of need to make the point clear about this is the real life. And if you're going to say on your website that we're about agility and compassion and integrity and accountability, then this is about integrity, accountability, agility, and compassion, right? So cool, but like, is it your definition of what it is, or is it actually the place that you're funding? And you have no business then funding in a place where you're not okay with providing support to people, and the support that they need, not the support that you've decided they need. Because we have all the policies and procedures as are dictated by the donor. Now it's our turn to say, okay, this is the additional bits and pieces that we know we need. And so that is an easier conversation, I think, to have with foundations, in my experience. Chrissy, you may have a different one. It's a very difficult conversation to have with institutional donors, many of whom are not even interested in paying for salaries, let alone, or like rent, let alone other things. But I think that the more we sort of incorporate these conversations into our programming, so it's not, I think, like Chrissy said, it's not something separate, it's not an extra. It is what we are and do. So we can do because we have a duty of care. Then I think it makes the conversation almost a little bit more palatable in many places. And again, I mean, I struggle with the institutional donors on this. The very big institutional donors can sometimes create space for this sort of thing. It's the sort of small and medium-sized institutional donors who just can't wiggle their way out of their own boxes.
Yeah, I think that's largely true. I think that's also for us sort of the wisdom and the beauty of that 3% budget line in every budget to duty of care is that's how it's coded. It's coded to duty of care. So it might be a travel expense. It might be a software expense for a reporter who's in, a digitally insecure environment. It might be an extra travel payment, like whatever it is, it's coded to duty of care. And that allows us to track those expenses in a way that is accurate for us and helps us to understand how we're spending money, but also from a funder's perspective, gives them real clarity about what's being spent in a way that's also, a little bit less uncomfortable. So I highly recommend that as a overall fundraising strategy is to make duty of care a core piece of your work that actually can't be extricated from the programs, because in truth, it can't, right? Because as organizational operators, we don't say, well, for the next 3 months, we're going to be operating without duty of care because we accepted this grant that didn't fund it. Therefore, our standards and our duty to care for you are totally different now that we accepted this grant. That's not the way that it works. So I think if we institutionalize it and we send the message to funders to say like, hey, this is the way it's going to be. I will say that one of, I think, the most extraordinary things that we've seen happen with duty of care over the last couple of years, probably the last 3 years in particular, is the degree to which Global Press's body of funders have really internalized and taken on duty of care themselves to the point where they are now holding other grantees accountable to say, like, well, what are your duty of care standards and principles? And I think everyone at Global Press has an extraordinary amount of pride for the degree to which we have been able to have these transparent conversations with funders, and now we are seeing them pay dividends in other organizations as more and more funders are starting to have more freedom and just comfort with saying, like, let's talk about duty of care, let's talk about safety and security, let's talk about wellness. I think it's also important to acknowledge that we're in a moment where workplace best practices are changing, right? Giving your best no longer means running yourself into the ground until you're about to die and you're so burnt out that, like, you can't even think straight. Part of duty of care is thinking about, like, how do you get your best out of your, like, their best out of your people? How do you do that? How do you create systems and practices that allow people to be at their best, at their healthiest? And that is, it's part of an organizational effectiveness strategy. So anytime a funder says they don't want to fund duty of care, like, it just doesn't make sense. One, because it's just the right thing to do. And two, there is real evidence to say that stronger, more effective organizations have duty of care protocols in place for their people.
Yeah, and I think also, just to add, I mean, also to mirror what Chrissy is saying, I think that beyond just other funders, I think that there are also other organizations that are now, it's now becoming a little bit more of a movement. So at the lab, we're part of a group called Accountable Now. And it's one of the core principles of the 12 commitments, the 12 accountability commitments that we make to belong to the group. And, you know, and they're also starting to look at the idea of actually making, so while it is part of the 12, they want to make a 13th, which is just about duty of care. And that 13th commitment, I think, you know, will then apply to both, you know, all the nonprofits that are part of Accountable Now, but also the donors that are part of Accountable Now. You know, the Transparency, Accountability and Participation Network, like the TAP network, they're starting to think about duty of care. I think it's really it's becoming more and more of a conversation. And I think one of the main messages that I wanted to get across here is it's actually our job as more proximate organizations that speak English and that have closer proximity to many donors, to push a lot of this for smaller nonprofits that are local, because so often local money is like for programming only, and smaller organizations just don't have the language or proximity or the space to be able to have these conversations in the first place, because it's just super awkward to have. But when you have organizations like us, no, we're not massive, but I think as we, you know, I think Christy's organization is super influential, and, you know, we're working on like being able to have smarter accountability conversations and better ones, and sort of like lead the space a bit. Then it's our job to have these conversations for others too, and say, hey, this is not just for us, this is for the sector, because if the sector is healthier, then we're gonna get better, you know, we will have better outcomes, essentially. And, you know, and I just keep on getting back to this like culture of sacrifice and guilt that like people that work in civil society have all the time. Oh, but I must give more time. With what? You know, we all lived through a pandemic, whether you were a doctor or someone who were working in civil society.
I will just add, I think, you know, from the funding perspective, I say this with no baggage, no accusation. I say it entirely rooted in love. It is, the duty of care work and the safety and security work has been the place where I have found most rapidly my own biases and assumptions, other funder biases and assumptions about the expectations of what the work costs to do well and meaningfully, the expectations of community-led work being done by the community and therefore having to invest in that community. Like the sort of dynamics of that have been the most complex and messy. And I will just say, like, I you know, when the pandemic first really rolled out in the States, I had a conversation both with Accountability Lab and Global Press, and both said to me in different ways, I was like, are your people okay? And I think, Christy, you actually said, like, I'm not worried about anyone out in the field. They all actually know what to do. If anyone gets COVID, it's going to be someone in our DC office. and I was like, okay, yeah, that's probably actually true. And I think when I talked to Blair, the CEO of Accountability Lab, he said something functionally about the same, like, we know how to do this. We just don't know how to do it actually here in the US. And so I think funders are really starting to grapple with their biases. And there's a way in which you can frame this as a, like, why are these lives not worth protecting the same way as if you would send your program officer out into the field? That's a more provocative way of putting it, I will admit, but not maybe the worst thing to try and poke at. And the other thing that I will say is what I said at the top, that for funders, sort of framing this as the most unrestricted, restricted money you can give. Like you can still sort of think about it as restricted or tagged. Christy referenced it as it's all tagged as duty of care. There are specific expenses that go along with it. So you can ask questions about it. And I will say that if it's a relatively small organization, making sure you work with whoever their accountant is, or whoever their sort of legal, usually there's a board member who's a lawyer, or whoever their pro bono lawyer is, to make sure that everybody actually understands how to deal with the restriction and the unrestriction and when it's usable and when it's not, because it is kind of weird. Not because anybody's dumb, it's just really weird to figure out. We have...
I like that again, Mary, because having someone help, you don't want this to sink you through an audit.
No, because it gets weird.
I don't understand. So it really, having somebody to just walk it through with you and to know how to code it and to know how to talk about it and know what it looks like through an audit is really, really helpful.
Well, and I will just say we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to get a couple of closing thoughts. But one of my goals for the next little while is to try and put together some materials about, like, this is how you would think about it from a very technical standpoint of, like, how you think about the accounting of it, how you think about the implementation of it. Here's how you calm your board down so they don't freak out, all that kind of stuff. I am so grateful both for Christy and Jean coming and joining for this conversation, and for all of you choosing to Zoom on in for the, and I wonder if either of you have any closing thoughts besides how wonderful and brilliant we all are. Christy, you're muted. Oh, there you are.
I was just saying how brilliant I was, that I couldn't figure out how to take it off mute. I think the thing that I would say is that we talk with and do consulting through Global Press News Services, the B2B facing side of Global Press, around duty of care a lot. And the number one thing that we hear people say is, we want it now and we don't have any money for it, but it's really important. And we always say, let's take that in reverse order. It's really important. We need to figure out how to raise money for it, and it's going to take time to get it right. Right. So I think that those are just three really important pieces to know. No matter what size organization you are, holistic and powerful duty of care is possible. We just have to create space for it in the organization. I strongly recommend, as a first step, putting together like a task force within the organization to just look at everybody's job descriptions. What is a way that every single person in the organization can incorporate duty of care into their daily work? And that works wonders as a first starting point.
I think I'm just also going to echo exactly that and say, but also understand who you're building your duty of care for. You know, and listen to your team and listen to what they need and be observant, and then think about it, and be willing to change your mind and change to new things if other things happen. So yeah, I think.
Thank you all. If people wanted to find out more, Christy and Jean, could you put it in the chat where they could go find out more about your particular projects?
Absolutely. And Mary, big thanks, especially to you, for leading the way and making all of this work possible. We really appreciate it.
And thank you to Catalyst for hosting us, and thank you all for joining.
Bye,
everyone.